The Duration of Life, a fairy tale by the Brothers Grimm. When God had created the world and was about to fix the length of each creature's life, the ass came and asked, "Lord, how long shall I live?" God replied, 30 years? Does that content thee?" The ass answered, "Ah, Lord, that is a long time. Think of my painful existence, carrying heavy burdens from morning to night, dragging sacks of corn to the mill so others may eat bread, and being cheered and refreshed with nothing but blows and kicks. Relieve me of a portion of this long time." God had pity on him and relieved him of 18 years. The ass went away comforted, and then the dog appeared. God said to the dog, "How long wouldst thou like to live?" 30 years are too many for the ass, but thou wilt be satisfied with that." The dog replied, "Lord, is that thy will? Consider how I shall have to run. My feet will never hold out so long. Once I lose my voice for barking and my teeth for biting, what will be left for me but to run from one corner to another and growl?" God saw that he was right and released him from 12 years of life. Then came the monkey. God said to the monkey, "Thou wilt certainly live 30 years willingly. Thou hast no need to work, as the ass and the dog have to do, and wilt always enjoy thyself." The monkey answered, "Ah, Lord, it may seem as if that were the case, but it is quite different. When it rains porridge, I have no spoon. I am always to play merry pranks and make faces which force people to laugh, and if they give me an apple and I bite into it, why, it is sour. How often sadness hides itself behind mirth. I shall never be able to hold out for 30 years. God was gracious and took off 10. At last, man appeared, joyous, healthy, and vigorous, and begged God to appoint his time for him. 30 years shalt thou live, said the Lord. Man cried, "What a short time, when I have built my house and my fire burns on my own hearth, when I have planted trees which blossom and bear fruit, and am just intending to enjoy my life, I am to die. O Lord, lengthen my time." "I will add to it the ass's 18 years, said God. "That is not enough," replied the man. "Thou shalt also have the dog's 12 years. "Still too little." "Well then," said God, "I will give thee the monkey's 10 years also, but more thou shalt not have." The man went away, but was not satisfied. So man lives 70 years. The first 30 are his human years, which are soon gone. Then he is healthy, merry, works with pleasure, and is glad of his life. Then follow the ass's 18 years, when one burden after another is laid on him. He has to carry the corn which feeds others, and blows and kicks are the reward of his faithful services. Then come the dog's 12 years, when he lies in the corner, growls, and has no longer any teeth to bite with. And when this time is over, the monkey's 10 years form the end. Then man is weak-headed and foolish, does silly things, and becomes the jest of the children. And Death's Messengers, a fairy tale by the Brothers Grimm. In ancient times, a giant was once traveling on a great highway when suddenly an unknown man sprang up before him and said, "Halt, not one step farther." The giant cried out, "What? A creature whom I can crush between my fingers wants to block my way. Who art thou that thou darest to speak so boldly?" "I am Death," answered the other. "No one resists me, and thou also must obey my commands." The giant refused and began to struggle with Death. It was a long, violent battle. Eventually, the giant got the upper hand and struck Death down with his fist, so that he dropped by a stone. The giant went his way, and Death lay there conquered, and so weak that he could not get up again. "What will be done now?" he said. "If I stay lying here in a corner? No one will die in the world, and it will get so full of people that they won't have room to stand beside each other." Meanwhile, a young man came along the road, strong and healthy, singing a song and glancing around on every side. When he saw the half-fainting one, he went compassionately to him, raised him up, poured a strengthening draught out of his flask for him, and waited till he came round. "Dost thou know," said the stranger whilst he was getting up, "who I am and who it is whom thou hast helped on his legs again?" "No," answered the youth, "I do not know thee." "I am Death," said he. "I spare no one, and can make no exception with thee, but that thou mayst see that I am grateful, I promise thee that I will not fall on thee unexpectedly, but will send my messengers to thee before I come and take thee away." "Well," said the youth, "it is something gained that I shall know when thou comest, and at any rate be safe from thee for so long." Then he went on his way, and was light-hearted, and enjoyed himself, and lived without thought, However, youth and health did not last long. Soon came sicknesses and sorrows that tormented him by day and took away his rest by night. Die, I shall not, he said to himself, for death will send his messengers before that, but I do wish these wretched days of sickness were over. As soon as he felt himself well again, he began once more to live merrily. Then one day, someone tapped him on the shoulder. He looked round, and Death stood behind him and said, "Follow me, the hour of thy departure from this world has come." "What?" replied the man. "Wilt thou break thy word? Didst thou not promise me that thou wouldst send thy messengers to me before coming thyself? I have seen none." "Silence," answered Death. "Have I not sent one messenger to thee after another? Did not fever come and smite thee and shake thee and cast thee down? Has dizziness not bewildered thy head? Has not gout twitched thee in all thy limbs? Did not thine ears sing? Did not toothache bite into thy cheeks? Was it not dark before thine eyes? And besides all that, has not my own brother then sleep reminded thee every night of me? Didst thou not lie by night as if thou wert already dead?" The man could make no answer. He yielded to his fate and went away with Death. Master Freem, Master Cobblers All, a fairy tale by the Brothers Grimm. Master Freem was a short, thin, but lively man who never rested a moment. His face, of which his turned-up nose was the only prominent feature, was marked with smallpox and pale as death. His hair was gray and shaggy, his eyes small, but they glanced perpetually about on all sides. He saw everything, criticized everything, knew everything best, and was always in the right. When he went into the streets, he moved his arms about as if he were rowing. Once he struck the pail of a girl who was carrying water so high in the air that he himself was wetted all over by it. "Stupid thing," he cried to her while he was shaking himself, "couldst thou not see that I was coming behind thee?" By trade, he was a shoemaker, and when he worked, he pulled his thread out with such force that he drove his fist into everyone who did not keep far enough off. No apprentice stayed more than a month with him, for he always found some fault with even the best work. At one time, it was that the stitches were not even. At another, that one shoe was too long, or one heel higher than the other, or the leather not cut large enough. "Wait," he said to his apprentice, "I will soon show thee how we make skins soft." And he brought a strap and gave him a couple of strokes across the back. He called them all sluggards. He himself did not turn much work out of his hands, for he never sat still for a quarter of an hour. If his wife got up very early in the morning and lit the fire, he jumped out of bed and ran barefoot into the kitchen, crying, "Wilt thou burn my house down for me? That is a fire one could roast an ox by. Does wood cost nothing?" If the servants were standing by their wash tubs and laughing and telling each other all they knew, he scolded them and said, "There stand the geese cackling and forgetting their work to gossip. And why fresh soap? Disgraceful extravagance and shameful idleness into the bargain. They want to save their hands and not rub the things properly." And out he would run and knock a pail full of soap and water over so that the whole kitchen was flooded. Someone was building a new house, so he hurried to the window to look on. "There, they are using that red sandstone again, that never dries," he cried. "No one will ever be healthy in that house, and just look how badly the fellows are laying the stones. Besides, the mortar is good for nothing. It ought to have gravel in it, not sand. I shall live to see that house tumble down on the people who are in it." He sat down, put a couple of stitches in, and then jumped up again, unfastened his leather apron, and cried, "I will just go out and appeal to those men's consciences." He stumbled upon the carpenters. "What's this?" he cried. "You are not working by the line. Do you expect the beams to be straight? One wrong will put all wrong." He snatched an axe out of a carpenter's hand and wanted to show him how he ought to cut. But as a cart loaded with clay came by, he threw the axe away and hastened to the peasant who was walking by the side of it. "You are not in your right mind," said he, "yoking young horses to a heavily laden cart. The poor beasts will die on the spot." The peasant did not give him an answer, and Freem in a rage ran back into his workshop. When he was setting himself to work again, the apprentice reached him a shoe. "Well, what's that again?" he screamed. "Haven't I told you not to cut shoes so broad? Who would buy a shoe like this, which is hardly anything else but a sole?" I insist on my orders being followed exactly. Master, answered the apprentice, you may easily be quite right about the shoe being a bad one, but it is the one which you yourself cut out and yourself set to work at. When you jumped up a while since, you knocked it off the table, and I have only just picked it up. An angel from heaven, however, would never make you believe that. One night, Master Freem dreamed he was dead and on his way to heaven. When he arrived, he knocked loudly at the door. I wonder, said he to himself, that they have no knocker on the door. One knocks one's knuckles sore. The Apostle Peter opened the door and wanted to see who demanded admission so noisily. Ah, it's you, Master Freem, said he. Well, I'll let you in, but I warn you that you must give up that habit of yours and find fault with nothing you see in heaven, or you may fare ill. You might have spared your warning, answered Freem. I know already what is seemly, and here, God be thanked, everything is perfect, and there is nothing to blame as there is on earth. So he went in and walked up and down the wide expanses of heaven. He looked around him, to the left and to the right, but sometimes shook his head or muttered something to himself. Then he saw two angels who were carrying away a beam. It was the beam which someone had in his own eye, whilst he was looking for the splinter in the eye of another. They did not, however, carry the beam lengthways, but obliquely. Did anyone ever see such a piece of stupidity? Thought Master Freem, but he said nothing and seemed satisfied with it. It comes to the same thing after all, whichever way they carry the beam, straight or crooked, if they only get along with it, and truly I do not see them knock against anything. Soon after this, he saw two angels who were drawing water out of a well into a bucket, but at the same time, he observed that the bucket was full of holes, and that the water was running out of it on every side. They were watering the earth with rain. Hang it, he exclaimed, but then happily recollected himself, and thought, perhaps it is only a pastime. If it is an amusement, then it seems they can do useless things of this kind even here in heaven, where people, as I have already noticed, do nothing but idle about. He went farther and saw a cart which had stuck fast in a deep hole. It's no wonder, said he to the man who stood by it. Who would load so unreasonably? What have you there? Good wishes, replied the man. I could not go along the right way with it, but still I have pushed it safely up here, and they won't leave me sticking here. In fact, an angel did come and harness two horses to it. That's quite right, thought Freem, but two horses won't get that cart out. It must at least have four to it. Another angel came and brought two more horses. She did not, however, harness them in front of it, but behind. That was too much for Master Freem. Clumsy creature, he burst out. What are you doing there? Has anyone ever since the world began seen a cart drawn in that way? But you, in your conceited arrogance, think that you know everything best. He was going to say more, but one of the inhabitants of heaven seized him by the throat and pushed him forth with irresistible strength. Beneath the gateway, Master Freem turned his head round to take one more look at the cart and saw that it was being raised into the air by four winged horses. At this moment, Master Freem awoke. Things are certainly arranged in heaven otherwise than they are on earth, said he to himself, and that excuses much. But who can see horses harnessed both behind and before with patience? To be sure they had wings, but who could know that? It is, besides, great folly to fix a pair of wings to a horse that has four legs to run with already. But I must get up, or else they will make nothing but mistakes for me in my house. It is a lucky thing for me, though, that I am not really dead. The Goose Girl at the Well. A Fairy Tale by the Brothers Grimm. Once upon a time, there lived a very old woman who resided with her flock of geese in a desolate area among the mountains, where she had a small house. The wasteland was surrounded by a dense forest, and every morning the old woman would take her crutch and hobble into it. Despite her age, she was remarkably active, gathering grass for her geese, picking all the wild fruits within her reach, and carrying everything back home on her back. Despite the heavy load, she always managed to bring it home safely. Whenever she met someone, she greeted them courteously. Good day, dear countryman, it's a fine day. Ah, you may wonder why I drag grass around, but everyone must bear their burden. However, people avoided encountering her if possible, preferring to take a longer route. When a father passed by with his sons, he whispered to them, Beware of the old woman. She has claws under her gloves. She is a witch. One morning, a handsome young man was walking through the forest. The sun was shining brightly, birds were singing, a cool breeze rustled through the leaves, and he was filled with joy and happiness. He hadn't encountered anyone yet when he suddenly saw the old witch kneeling on the ground, cutting grass with a sickle. She had already gathered a whole load in her cloth, and next to her were 2 baskets filled with wild apples and pears. "But dear little mother," he said, "how can you carry all that away?" "I must carry it, dear sir," she replied. Rich people's children don't need to do such things, but as the saying goes among peasants, don't look back. You'll only see how crooked your back is. "Will you help me?" she asked as he stood beside her. "Your back is still straight and your legs young. It would be nothing to you. Besides, my house isn't far from here. It's behind the hill on the heath. You could leap there in no time." The young man took pity on the old woman. "My father is certainly not a peasant," he replied, "but a wealthy count. Nevertheless, to show you that it's not only peasants who can carry things, I'll take your bundle." "If you're willing," she said, "I'd be very grateful. It'll take you about an hour to walk there, but what does that matter to you? You just need to carry the apples and pears, too." The young man now found the prospect a little daunting when he heard about an hour's walk, but the old woman wouldn't let him off, loaded the bundle onto his back, and hung the 2 baskets on his arm. "Look, it's very light," she said. "No, it's not light," replied the Count, pulling a rueful face. "Truly, this bundle weighs as heavily as if it were filled with cobblestones, and the apples and pears are as heavy as lead. I can hardly breathe." He felt like putting everything down again, but the old woman wouldn't allow it. "Just look," she said mockingly. "The young gentleman won't carry what I, an old woman, have often dragged around. You're good with words, but when it comes to action, you want to run away. Why are you standing there hesitating?" she continued. "Get going. No one will take the bundle off your back." As long as he walked on level ground, he could manage, but when they reached the hill and had to climb with stones rolling under his feet as if they were alive, it was beyond his strength. Beads of sweat stood on his forehead and ran, hot and cold, down his back. "Ma'am," he said, "I can't go any further. I need to rest a little." "Not here," replied the old woman. "Once we reach our destination, you can rest. For now, you must continue forward. Who knows what good it may do you?" "Old woman, you are becoming shameless," exclaimed the Count, attempting to throw off the bundle, but he struggled in vain. It clung to his back as if it were grown there. He twisted and turned, but couldn't shake it off. The old woman laughed at this and hopped about gleefully on her crutch. "Don't get angry, dear sir," she said. "Your face is turning as red as a turkey cock's. Bear your burden patiently. I'll give you a good reward when we arrive home." What could he do? He had to accept his fate and patiently crawl along behind the old woman. She seemed to become more agile, and his load grew heavier. Suddenly, she leaped up, jumped onto the bundle, and seated herself on top of it. Despite her frail appearance, she was heavier than the stoutest country lass. The young man's knees trembled, but whenever he hesitated, the old woman struck his legs with a switch and stinging nettles. Groaning continually, he climbed the mountain and finally reached the old woman's house, nearly collapsing from exhaustion. When the geese saw the old woman, they flapped their wings, stretched their necks, and rushed toward her, cackling all the while. Following the flock was an old maid, wielding a stick, strong and big, yet ugly as the night. "Good mother," she said to the old woman, "have you encountered any trouble? You've been gone so long." "Not at all, my dear daughter," she replied. "Nothing bad happened. On the contrary, I met this kind gentleman who carried my burden for me. Imagine, he even carried me on his back when I was tired. The journey didn't seem long at all. We laughed and joked the whole time." Finally, the old woman slid down, removed the bundle from the young man's back, took the baskets from his arm, looked at him kindly, and said, "Now sit on the bench by the door and rest. You've earned your reward, and it won't be denied to you." Then she said to the goose girl, "My dear daughter, go inside. It's not proper for you to be alone with a young gentleman. Don't add fuel to the fire. He might fall in love with you." The Count didn't know whether to laugh or cry. A sweetheart like that, he thought, couldn't capture my heart even if she were 30 years younger. Meanwhile, the old woman caressed and petted her geese as if they were children, then went inside the house with her daughter. The young man lay down on the bench under a wild apple tree. The air was warm and gentle. All around stretched a green meadow dotted with cowslips, wild thyme, and countless other flowers. Through the middle flowed a clear brook sparkling in the sun, while the white geese strolled back and forth or paddled in the water. "It's truly delightful here," he said, "but I'm so tired I can barely keep my eyes open. I'll rest a little. I just hope a gust of wind doesn't come and blow my legs off, for they're as weak as tinder." When he had slept for a while, the old woman came and shook him until he awoke. "Sit up," she said. "You cannot stay here. I have treated you harshly, but at least it hasn't cost you your life. You have no need for money or land. Here is something else for you." With that, she placed a small book into his hand, carved from a single emerald. "Take good care of it," she said. "It will bring you good fortune." The Count jumped up, feeling completely refreshed and strong again. He thanked the old woman for her gift and set off without even glancing back at the beautiful daughter. Even when he was some distance away, he could still hear the noisy cries of the geese in the distance. For 3 days, the Count wandered through the wilderness before finally finding his way out. He eventually arrived at a large town where no one recognized him. He was escorted to the royal palace, where the king and queen sat upon their throne. The Count knelt down, pulled the emerald book from his pocket, and placed it at the queen's feet. She motioned for him to rise and hand her the little book. However, as soon as she opened it and looked inside, she fell to the ground as if dead. The king's servants seized the Count and were about to take him to prison when the queen regained consciousness. She ordered them to release him and dismissed everyone so she could speak with him alone. Once they were alone, the queen began to weep bitterly and said, "Of what use are the splendors and honors that surround me? Every morning I awaken in pain and sorrow. I had 3 daughters, and the youngest was so beautiful that the whole world admired her. She was as white as snow, as rosy as an apple blossom, and her hair shone like sunbeams. When she cried, pearls and jewels fell from her eyes instead of tears. When she turned 15, the king summoned all 3 sisters to his throne. You should have seen how everyone marveled when the youngest entered. It was as if the sun were rising." Then the king spoke. "My daughters, I do not know when my last day will come. Today, I will decide what each of you shall receive after my death. You all claim to love me, but the one who truly loves me best shall receive the greatest reward." Each daughter claimed she loved him the most. "Can you not show me," said the king, "how much you love me, so I may understand?" The eldest said, "I love my father as much as the sweetest sugar." The second said, "I love my father as much as my most beautiful dress." But the youngest remained silent. Then the father asked, "And you, my dearest child, how much do you love me?" "I do not know, and can compare my love with nothing." Her father, however, insisted that she should name something. Eventually she said, "The best food does not please me without salt. Therefore I love my father like salt." Upon hearing this, the king became furious and declared, "If you love me like salt, then your love shall be repaid with salt." He then divided the kingdom between the 2 elder daughters and had a sack of salt tied to the youngest daughter's back. 2 servants led her into the wild forest. "We all begged and pleaded," continued the queen, "but the king's anger could not be appeased. She cried bitterly as she was forced to leave us, leaving a trail of pearls that flowed from her eyes. The king soon regretted his harsh decision and ordered a search of the entire forest for the poor child, but she could not be found. When I think about how wild beasts may have devoured her, I can hardly contain my sorrow. Yet, I console myself with the hope that she may still be alive, hiding in a cave or finding refuge with kind-hearted people." When I opened your little emerald book and saw a pearl inside, identical to those that used to fall from my daughter's eyes, you can imagine how deeply it moved me. Please, tell me how you came by that pearl." The Count explained that he received it from the strange old woman in the forest, whom he suspected to be a witch. However, he had neither seen nor heard anything about the queen's child. Determined to find answers, the king and queen resolved to seek out the old woman, believing that where the pearl came from, they would find news of their daughter. The old woman sat alone in her secluded place, spinning at her wheel. It was dusk, and a dim light flickered from the burning log on the hearth. Suddenly, a commotion outside announced the return of the geese from pasture, their hoarse cries filling the air. Shortly after, her daughter entered as well. However, the old woman barely acknowledged her and simply shook her head slightly. The daughter sat beside her, took up her spinning, and worked as swiftly as a young girl. For 2 hours, they sat in silence, exchanging not a single word. Finally, a rustling at the window drew their attention, and 2 fiery eyes peered in, the eyes of an old night owl that hooted 3 times. The old woman glanced up briefly and then said, "Now, my dear daughter, it is time for you to go out and do your work." The daughter rose and went out. Where did she go? Across the meadows and into the valley. Finally, she arrived at a well surrounded by 3 ancient oak trees. Meanwhile, the full moon had risen above the mountains, casting enough light to find a needle. She removed a covering from her face, bent down to the well, and began to wash herself. When she finished, she dipped the covering in the water and laid it on the meadow to bleach and dry in the moonlight. What a transformation occurred! Never had such a change been seen before. As the gray mask fell away, her golden hair gleamed like sunbeams, flowing like a mantle over her entire form. Her eyes sparkled like stars in the sky, and her cheeks blushed softly like apple blossoms. The fair maiden was sad. She sat down and wept bitterly. One tear after another forced itself out of her eyes and rolled through her long hair to the ground. There she sat, and would have remained for a long time if there had not been a rustling and cracking in the boughs of the neighboring tree. She sprang up like a roe that has been overtaken by the shot of a hunter. Just then, the moon was obscured by a dark cloud, and in an instant, the maiden had put on the old skin and vanished, like a light blown out by the wind. She ran back home, trembling like an aspen leaf. The old woman was standing on the threshold, and the girl was about to relate what had befallen her, but the old woman laughed kindly and said, "I already know all." She led her into the room and lighted a new log. However, instead of sitting down to her spinning again, she fetched a broom and began to sweep and scour. "Everything must be clean and sweet," she said to the girl. "But, mother," said the maiden, "why are you starting work so late? What are you expecting?" "Do you know what time it is?" asked the old woman. "Not yet midnight," answered the maiden, "but past 11 o'clock." "Do you not remember," continued the old woman, "that it is 3 years today since you came to me? Your time is up. We can no longer remain together." The girl was terrified and said, "Oh, dear mother, are you going to cast me out? Where shall I go? I have no friends and no home to return to. I have always done as you asked, and you have always been pleased with me. Please do not send me away." The old woman would not tell the maiden what lay ahead for her. "My time here is over," she said to her, "but before I leave, the house and parlor must be clean. Therefore, do not hinder me in my work. Do not worry about yourself. You will find a roof to shelter you, and the wages I will give you will be satisfactory." "But tell me what is going to happen," the maiden continued to plead. "I tell you again, do not hinder me in my work. Say no more. Go to your chamber, remove the skin from your face, put on the silken gown you wore when you first came to me, and wait in your chamber until I call you." But I must once more tell of the king and queen, who had journeyed forth with the count to seek out the old woman in the wilderness. The count had strayed from them in the woods at night and had to walk alone. The next day, he felt he was on the right path. He continued until darkness fell, then climbed a tree, intending to spend the night there, fearing he might lose his way. When the moon illuminated the surroundings, he saw a figure descending the mountain. She had no stick in her hand, yet he recognized her as the goose girl he had seen before in the old woman's house. "Ah," he exclaimed, "there she comes. If I can catch one witch, the other won't escape." But he was astonished when she reached the well, removed the skin, and washed herself. Her golden hair cascaded down, and she appeared more beautiful than anyone he had ever seen. He hardly dared to breathe, leaning forward through the leaves to stare at her. Perhaps he leaned too far, or for whatever reason, the branch suddenly cracked, and in that moment, the maiden slipped into the skin, leapt away like a roe, and disappeared from his sight as the moon was veiled by clouds. Hardly had she disappeared when the Count descended from the tree and hastened after her with nimble steps. He had not been gone long before he saw, in the twilight, two figures coming over the meadow. It was the king and queen, who had perceived from a distance the light shining in the old woman's little house and were heading towards it. The Count told them about the wonderful things he had seen by the well, and they had no doubt it was their lost daughter. They walked onward full of joy and soon arrived at the little house. The geese were sitting all around it, their heads tucked under their wings, fast asleep, and not one of them stirred. The king and queen peered in through the window. The old woman sat there quietly spinning, nodding her head but never looking around. The room was perfectly clean, as if inhabited by little men of mist who left no dust on their feet. They did not see their daughter, though. They gazed at all this for a long time, then finally gathered courage and knocked softly on the window. The old woman seemed to have been expecting them. She rose and called out quite kindly, "Come in, I already know you." When they entered the room, the old woman said, "You could have spared yourselves the long journey if you had not unjustly driven away your child 3 years ago, who is so good and lovable. No harm has come to her. For 3 years she has tended the geese, and with them she has learned no evil, but has kept her heart pure. You, however, have been sufficiently punished by the misery in which you have lived." Then she went to the chamber and called, "Come out, my little daughter." The door opened, and the princess stepped out in her silken garments, with her golden hair and shining eyes. It was as if an angel from heaven had entered. She went up to her father and mother, embraced them, and kissed them. There was no help for it. They all had to weep for joy. The young count stood near them, and when she noticed him, she blushed like a moss rose, though she herself did not know why. The king said, "My dear child, I have given away my kingdom. What shall I give you?" "She needs nothing," said the old woman. "I give her the tears that she has shed on your account. They are precious pearls, finer than those found in the sea, and worth more than your entire kingdom. I also give her my little house as payment for her services." After saying this, the old woman disappeared from their sight. The walls rattled a little, and when the king and queen looked around, the little house had transformed into a splendid palace. A royal table was set, and servants were bustling about. The story continues further, but my grandmother, who told it to me, had partly lost her memory and had forgotten the rest. I will always believe that the beautiful princess married the count, and that they remained together in the palace, living in happiness for as long as God willed it. Whether the snow-white geese, which were kept near the little hut, were indeed young maidens, no one should take offense, whom the old woman had taken under her protection, and whether they now regained their human form and stayed as handmaids to the young queen, I do not exactly know, but I suspect so. What is certain is that the old woman was not a witch, as people thought, but a wise woman who meant well. It was likely she who, at the princess's birth, gave her the gift of shedding pearls instead of tears. Such things do not happen nowadays, otherwise the poor would soon become rich. Eve's Various Children, a fairy tale by the Brothers Grimm. When Adam and Eve were driven out of paradise, they were compelled to build a house for themselves on unfruitful ground and eat their bread in the sweat of their brow. Adam dug up the land, and Eve spun. Every year, Eve brought a child into the world. However, the children were unlike each other, some pretty and some ugly. After a considerable time had gone by, God sent an angel to them to announce that he was coming to inspect their household. Eve, delighted that the Lord should be so gracious, cleaned her house diligently, decked it with flowers, and strewed reeds on the floor. Then she brought in her children, but only the beautiful ones. She washed and bathed them, combed their hair, put clean raiment on them, and cautioned them to conduct themselves decorously and modestly in the presence of the Lord. They were to bow down before him civilly, hold out their hands, and answer his questions modestly and sensibly. The ugly children were, however, not to let themselves be seen. One hid himself beneath the hay, another under the roof, a third in the straw, the fourth in the stove, the fifth in the cellar, the sixth under a tub, the seventh beneath the wine cask, the 8th under an old fur cloak, the 9th and 10th beneath the cloth out of which she always made their clothes, and the 11th and 12th beneath the leather out of which she cut their shoes. She had scarcely finished when there was a knock at the house door. Adam looked through a chink and saw that it was the Lord. Adam opened the door respectfully, and the Heavenly Father entered. There, in a row, stood the pretty children, who bowed before him, held out their hands, and knelt down. The Lord, however, began to bless them, laid his hands on the first, and said, "Thou shalt be a powerful king," and to the second, "Thou a prince," to the third, "Thou a count," to the fourth, "Thou a knight," to the fifth, "Thou a nobleman," to the sixth, "Thou a burgher," to the seventh, "Thou a merchant," to the eighth, "Thou a learned man." He bestowed upon them all his richest blessings. When Eve saw that the Lord was so mild and gracious, she thought, "I will bring hither my ill-favored children also. It may be that he will bestow his blessing on them likewise." So she ran and brought them out of the hay, the straw, the stove, and wherever else she had concealed them. Then came the whole coarse, dirty, shabby, sooty band. The Lord smiled, looked at them all, and said, "I will bless these also." He laid his hands on the first and said to him, "Thou shalt be a peasant," to the second, "Thou a fisherman," to the third, "Thou a smith," to the fourth, "Thou a tanner," to the fifth, "Thou a weaver," to the sixth, "Thou a shoemaker," to the seventh, "Thou a tailor," to the eighth, "Thou a potter," to the ninth, "Thou a wagoner," to the 10th, "Thou a sailor," to the 11th, "Thou an errand boy," to the 12th, "Thou a scullion all the days of thy life." When Eve had heard all this, she said, "Lord, how unequally thou dividest thy gifts. After all, they are all my children, whom I have brought into the world. Thy favors should be given to all alike." But God answered, "Eve, thou dost not understand. It is right and necessary that the entire world should be supplied from thy children. If they were all princes and lords, who would grow corn, thresh it, grind and bake it? Who would be blacksmiths, weavers, carpenters, masons, laborers, tailors, and seamstresses? Each shall have his own place, so that one shall support the other, and all shall be fed like the limbs of one body." Then Eve answered, "Ah, Lord, forgive me. I was too quick in speaking to thee. Have thy divine will with my children."